Chief Travis Keene slammed his fist on the briefing table, pointed his finger directly into Claire Rourke's face, and said it loud enough for every operator in the room to hear. She's the weakest link. That shoulder fails out there. Someone dies. And that someone dies because we let her back in. 2 operators laughed. Nobody argued. Claire stood completely still, her eyes locked on his, her jaw tight, her rebuilt shoulder aching beneath the uniform that she had earned twice, once before the injury, once after it. She said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then she looked at the storm map and said, "When this plan breaks, and it will break, you'll want the person who built what comes next. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel, follow every part to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The rehearsal had been running for 40 minutes before it fell apart. Not in a dramatic way. Not with an explosion or a failed jump or a weapons malfunction. It fell apart the way things usually did in the real world, quietly. In the middle of something routine, when nobody was expecting it. Claire Rourke was securing her extraction harness for the 3rd time that morning when her right shoulder locked. Not violently. Not with the sharp crack that had put her in surgery 8 months earlier. Just a slow grinding refusal muscle and rebuilt tissue sending a warning she had learned to read the way some people read weather. She stopped, breathed, made a small internal adjustment, and finished the buckle in 4 seconds. She thought nobody noticed. She was wrong. Chief Travis Keene had been watching her from across the staging area. He had been watching her since she walked back through the door at Fort Sable Joint Maritime Base 3 weeks ago with her medical clearance signed and her uniform pressed like she had never left. He had watched her in the weight room, watched her on the obstacle course, watched her in the briefing room. He watched the way a man watches something he believes is going to fail and wants to be able to say afterward that he saw it coming. Rourke. His voice carried across the staging bay. Several operators stopped what they were doing. Claire turned. She already knew by the tone that this was not going to be a private conversation. Keene walked toward her slowly, deliberately, with the loose-shouldered ease of a man who had been doing this job for 17 years and believed those years entitled him to say whatever he thought necessary. He was 38, broad, with a jaw that looked like it had been shaped from something harder than bone. The operators around him had heard his opinions on Claire Rourke for 3 weeks. Most of them hadn't pushed back. "Your shoulder locked," he said. Not a question. A verdict. It hesitated. "I corrected it." "On a harness," Keene said. "A harness, you're supposed to be able to work in the dark. Underwater, while someone is shooting at you." It hesitated. "And I corrected it," Claire said again. Her voice was level. She had made a decision early. She was not going to win this by raising her voice. And she was not going to win it by showing him her anger. She was going to win it by being right when the moment required it. That was the only currency that mattered in a room like this one. Keene turned to address the broader room. That was when Claire understood this was a performance, not a confrontation. "I want everyone to hear this," he said. "Because when we get to Grayhaven Island and the plan starts coming apart, and it will come apart, because plans always do, I want people to know I said it now." He looked back at Claire. "She's the weakest link. When everything goes wrong out there, she'll be the reason someone doesn't come home." 2 of the younger operators laughed. Not loud, more like a reflex. The kind of laugh that comes from wanting to belong to the version of the room where the senior man is always right. Petty Officer Wesley Dunn, standing near the medical kit on the far bench, did not laugh. He looked at the floor. Claire noticed. Filed it away. She let the silence settle before she answered. Long enough that Keene's declaration had time to sit in the air between them. Long enough that the 2 operators who had laughed had time to wonder whether the laugh had been the right response. "If everything goes according to plan," Claire said, "you may never need me, but plans don't always go according to plan, Chief. And when this one doesn't, and you're right, It will break somewhere. You'll be glad someone spent the last 3 weeks building what comes next. She picked up the storm map from the table beside her and turned back to it. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was finished. Keene stared at her back for a moment. Then he walked away. Nobody filled the silence. Commander Elliot Harrow arrived at Fort Sable's primary briefing room at 6:30 with a coffee he hadn't had time to finish and a folder that rewrote the operation's timeline by 12 hours. He was 43, lean in the way that men who never stop moving stay lean, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a reputation inside the special operations community that had more weight than his rank. He had pulled people out of places that didn't appear on public maps, had signed off on missions that never made the news, and had spent enough years in the work to know that the mission on paper was almost never the mission on the ground. "Sit down," he said before the last operator had cleared the door. The room settled fast. Harrow had that effect. The timetable on Operation Safe Tide has changed. "We moved 12 hours earlier than scheduled." He let that land before he continued. "Here's why." He flattened the updated weather chart on the table. The cyclone that had been a peripheral concern when the mission was first approved had accelerated overnight. It was no longer a weather variable to be managed. It was a hard deadline. When it made landfall on Grayhaven Island, every extraction route closed simultaneously. No helicopter approach, no maritime corridor, nothing in or out. "We have 9 adults on that island," Harrow said. 9 disaster relief workers who went there to help the local population recover from the flooding in April. They were supposed to be on a flight home 4 days ago. That flight didn't happen because somebody put a bomb on the runway. He paused. Not for effect. Harrow was not a man given to theatrical pauses. He paused because he wanted the next part to be heard clearly. "The island's main harbor has been seized by an armed smuggling group. We don't know their full numbers. We know they're armed. We know they're organized, and we know they've been watching the coastline since at least yesterday." He looked around the room. "Our approved extraction route is a single helicopter approach to the northern landing zone. We lift the civilians. We're gone before the storm arrives. And if that goes sideways?" one of the operators asked. "That," Harrow said, "is what contingency planning is for." His eyes moved across the room and landed briefly on Claire. "Lieutenant Rourke has been working a backup route for the past 10 days. Some of you know that. Some of you have opinions about it." His tone made clear what he thought of those opinions. Those opinions don't change the operational calculus. Every team leaves with one approved route and one contingency. That hasn't changed. He closed the folder. "We depart at 0400. Questions. There were questions about equipment loads, communications protocols, the medical status of the 9 civilians. Claire answered 3 of them before Keene answered 1. She did it without making it a point. She simply knew the details, because she had spent the last 10 days learning them while other people were forming opinions. After the briefing room cleared, Harrow stopped her near the door. "A word, Lieutenant." She waited while the last operator filed out. Harrow kept his voice low, not conspiratorial, practical. "You know you're listed as alternate mission commander." "Yes." Sir? "I want to make sure you understand what that means in practical terms. If I'm incapacitated during the operation, command transfers to you. Not to the most senior enlisted operator. Not to whoever has the most years in. To you." He held her eyes. "I need to know you're prepared to act on that. Not just receive it." "I'm prepared," Claire said. Harrow studied her for a moment with the specific attention of a man who had learned to read people in very short windows of time. Whatever he found in her face, it satisfied him. "Good," he said. "The team doesn't need to hear that scene right now. But I wanted you to hear it clearly." He picked up his folder. "Get your kit ready. It's a long night." Claire stood in the empty briefing room after he left and looked at the storm map for a long time. She was not afraid of the mission. She had been on difficult missions before her injury had been on one. The night her shoulder came apart. A fast rope entry in high winds that had gone wrong in the specific, mundane way that fast rope entries in high winds sometimes did. She had finished the mission. She had come home. She had spent 8 months in surgery and rehabilitation and clearance evaluations. And she had come back. What she was afraid of, not afraid, she corrected herself. What she was realistically assessing was the thing Keene had given a name to. Not that she would fail, but that if something went wrong, the failure would be assigned to her before anyone examined the facts. And that assignment would stick because it was waiting to be made. She rolled up the storm map and put it under her arm. The only answer to that was to not fail. They left Fort Sable before the sun came up. The water crossing took 3 hours in conditions that were already deteriorating, not dangerously, but enough to make clear that the cyclone was not waiting for anyone's schedule. The sea moved with an early urgency, heavy swells that arrived before the wind announced them. The particular gray of open ocean before a major storm that looked less like weather and more like a warning. Claire spent most of the crossing reviewing her contingency notes. Not because she hadn't memorized them, she had, but because going over them again in the actual physical conditions of this crossing helped her identify the places where paper planning met real-world friction. The old Coast Guard lifeboat station on the eastern cliffs was 1,200 meters beyond the ridge that separated Grayhaven Island's northern face from its eastern shoreline. The path to it crossed 2 terrain features that flooding had altered since the last survey map was drawn. She had flagged both. She had flagged a third one she found in the satellite imagery. A section of access road that sat only about a meter above the high tide line and would begin going underwater once the storm surge reached the island. She made a note. Keene sat across the transport from her. He did not review anything. He had his eyes closed, his arms crossed, the posture of a man who believed that preparation was a sign of uncertainty and that real professionals simply performed. He had been doing this for 17 years. The preparation, he had made clear in the past 3 weeks, was already done. Wesley Dunn caught Claire's eye across the hull of the transport and gave her a small nod. Not a validation of her planning, not a signal of allegiance, just a human acknowledgement. She returned it and went back to her notes. Grayhaven Island received them like a place that had already decided things were going badly. The landing on the northern shore was rough. A sea state had kicked up in the last hour, and the approach required a controlled drop into chest-deep water, followed by a controlled push toward the rocky beach through surf that wanted to make decisions for them. Claire went in beside Dunn, kept her right shoulder above the worst of the wave force, and came up out of the water moving. No one made a comment about her shoulder. There was nothing to make a comment about. The research station where the relief workers had sheltered was a 2-kilometer movement from the landing site, inland and slightly elevated. The team moved in 2 elements with the practiced compression of people who had done this together for years, with the exception of Claire, who was moving with them for the first time since her return. She fit herself into the formation without discussion, took the position Harrow assigned her, and matched the pace. The station itself was a low concrete building that had been built to survive weather and had mostly succeeded. One side wall had a crack running from the foundation to the roofline where flooding had stressed the earth beneath it. The windows facing the harbor had been covered with anything the occupants could find: stormboard, furniture panels, a section of what appeared to be an overturned workbench. Someone inside had been thinking about security even without military training. That, Claire thought, was a good sign. Frightened people who could still think clearly were easier to move than frightened people who couldn't. Harrow made contact at the outer door. The relief workers heard the approach, heard the identification codes, and opened up. 9 people, in the varying states of exhaustion and tension that came from being trapped in a concrete room for 4 days while an island deteriorated around them. They were not panicking. They were not catatonic. They were tired, hungry, alert, and desperately relieved to see people who knew what they were doing. Dr. Lena Ortiz was on her feet when the door opened. She was 45, with dark eyes that moved across the SEAL team, with the rapid assessment of a woman who had spent years making decisions in places where the decisions mattered. She shook Harrow's hand, then immediately began describing the situation. One member of her team, an engineer named Garrett Walsh, had a broken ankle sustained during the flooding 2 days earlier. He was mobile with support but could not manage rough terrain without assistance. And she needed 5 minutes to gather the medical records before she left. "We don't have 5 minutes," Keene said. "Then you'll leave without them," Ortiz said. "Without looking at him, and Grayhaven Island's drinking water supply will be contaminated within 6 weeks because the treatment records are stored here and nowhere else. Tell me which you prefer." Keene opened his mouth. Harrow raised one hand, a small gesture, barely visible. The kind that carried 17 years of commanding men who needed to be told when to stop. 4 minutes, Harrow said to Ortiz. "I'll take 3, she said. And she was already moving. Claire watched this and felt a specific recognition. Dr. Ortiz was the person in the room who knew things that weren't in any briefing document, who understood the physical geography of this island, the way the SEAL team's satellite maps could not. She filed that recognition as something to return to. While Ortiz gathered her records and Dunn checked on Walsh's ankle, Claire moved to the east-facing window and studied the harbor. She could see the lights. Not many, 2 or 3 visible from this angle, but they were moving in a pattern that wasn't weather. Boats or people with lights on a dock, moving with the specific purposefulness of people who had a plan and were executing it. The harbor was supposed to be occupied. She had known that from the briefing. Seeing it was different from knowing it. She moved to where Harrow was reviewing the communications setup. "The lights in the harbor are active," she said quietly. "Moving in a coordinated pattern. They're not just sitting on the boats." Harrow looked at her. "You think they've been tipped? I think they're doing something organized at night in worsening weather. And I'd like to know what, before we move toward the northern landing zone." Harrow turned to the team's ISR feed on his tablet and spent 30 seconds reviewing it. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the way a careful man's expression shifted when something he hadn't expected required a recalibration. "Sit tight," he said to the room. "We verify the LZ before we move." That was when Keene's temperature changed. He stepped close to Harrow, not insubordinate, not loud, but close enough that the conversation was partly private and partly a performance for the operators within earshot. "Commander, we're behind the weather. Every minute we stay in this building is a minute we don't have at the LZ. The harbor activity could be anything. It could be," Harrow said. "Or it couldn't, we verify. That's Rourke's call. She's the one who wants to slow us down." "No," Harrow said. "It's my call. Rourke flagged it. I'm acting on it." "Those are 2 different things, Chief." He turned back to his tablet. "Get the team ready to move on my signal." Keene moved away. He passed close enough to Claire that she could have touched his arm. He did not look at her. The verification took 19 minutes and produced something none of them wanted to find. The northern landing zone, the flat, exposed ground 2 kilometers inland from the coast where the extraction helicopter was scheduled to set down, had been staked. Not landmines, not a tripwire field, but human surveillance. 2 men with communication equipment, positioned on the high ground that overlooked the LZ, placed there specifically to watch and signal. Someone had known the route. The team pulled back to a ridge position and held. Harrow pulled Claire and Keene into a 3-person conversation behind a natural windbreak. "We can't use the LZ," Harrow said. He was not asking for input. He was stating the operational reality and opening the floor to options. "We clear it," Keene said. 2 operators, 10 minutes. It's done. And whoever they're signaling to knows the extraction is happening," Claire said. "We take down 2 people and the harbor lights start moving toward us." Keene looked at her. "So what's the play, Lieutenant?" It was the first time he had used her rank without turning it into an insult. She wasn't sure he realized he'd done it. "The contingency route," Claire said. "The old Coast Guard lifeboat station. Eastern Cliffs. We get the civilians there. We call for maritime extraction. and we move before the harbor group can reposition. The terrain between here and there is flood damaged, Keene said. We've got a man with a broken ankle and 9 people who've been sitting in a concrete box for 4 days. Yes, Claire said. And I've been looking at that terrain for 10 days. I know where the problem sections are. I know which ones we can move through and which ones we route around. She paused. It's not the fast route. It's the route that doesn't end with us cornered on a compromised LZ in front of a cyclone. Harrow looked between them. Lieutenant Rourke's route, he said. We move in 10 minutes. Keene caught up with Claire as she moved back toward the station. If you're wrong about the terrain, he said, low and direct. People get hurt. I know, Claire said. And if you're right that we should have pushed for the LZ. I'll say so. You'd admit it? I'd have to. People would be able to see the consequences. She looked at him steadily. That's how accountability works, Chief. It's not about who talks the loudest in the planning room. It's about what the situation looks like afterward. Keene said nothing. She moved past him, back to where Dunn was helping Walsh to his feet, back to where Ortiz was putting her records case over her shoulder with the compressed efficiency of a woman who had decided 4 days ago that she was going to survive this and had simply been waiting for the right people to arrive. The team formed up. The storm pressed closer, invisible but present in the changed quality of the air, in the smell of salt that had gotten heavier and stranger in the last hour. Claire took her position in the formations, checked her shoulder with a small rotation, and found it clear. They moved. The first kilometer went as well as anything could go in those conditions. The terrain was rough but navigable. The flooding had concentrated in the lower gullies, rather than spreading across the ridge, and Walsh managed with 2 operators lending support without significantly slowing the column. Ortiz moved like someone who had spent time on field missions, not at a military pace, but with the quiet steadiness of a person who had learned to economize her energy over long distances. The second kilometer was where Claire's notes met reality. The section of access road she had flagged in her planning, the low section that sat barely above the high tide line, had already begun to submerge. Not completely, not impassably, but the water was ankle-deep across a 30-meter section, moving with the lateral push of incoming tide, and the bottom was uncertain in the way that flooded road surfaces were uncertain before they gave way entirely. Claire stopped the column. She moved to the front, stood at the edge of the water, and read it. Is this the problem section? Harrow asked from behind her. One of them, she said. The flooding is earlier than the model predicted. Maybe 40 minutes ahead. She crouched, pressed her hand into the water, felt the road surface, the direction of flow, the drag on her sleeve. It's holding. The road base is intact. We can cross. 40 minutes ahead, Keene said from the rear of the column. He wasn't arguing. He was just marking it. 40 minutes ahead, Claire confirmed. We cross now or we don't cross at all. They crossed. Walsh went over with an operator on each side, and his broken ankle lifted. One-legged hopping and grimacing, but not stopping. The civilians crossed in pairs with operators guiding them. Ortiz crossed on her own, without being offered help, without being asked. Claire crossed last and felt the water rising against her boots as she reached the far side, the tide completing the section's submersion within the minute she had estimated. She turned back to look at the water and felt the specific, cold satisfaction of a plan making contact with reality and holding. 12 minutes later, the seawall passage proved her wrong. She had flagged it as a concern in her notes. A section of old coastal seawall that served as the most direct path around a flooded gully. It was elevated. It was solid, but it was exposed, and she had written a note to herself that she needed current tide data before she committed to it. In the speed of the last 90 minutes, she had committed to it without that data. The passage was already taking water, not from flooding, from wave action. The storm had kicked the sea up far enough that spray was clearing the top of the seawall and, more critically, that the far end of the passage was meeting active surge every 30 seconds or so. Not a continuous flood, a periodic one, but sufficient to make the passage dangerous in a way her notes had not accounted for. Claire stood at the entrance to the passage and made the assessment in 15 seconds. "We can't use this," she said. Keene came up beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "He did not say 'I told you so,'" he said. "What's the alternative?" It was a different question than the one she had expected from him. She turned to Ortiz. "You know this coastline," Claire said. "The pumping station, the old one. The decommissioned flood control pumping station. The aerial survey showed it near the base of the eastern cliffs. Is there access between here and there that doesn't use the seawall passage?" Ortiz thought for 3 seconds. "There's a maintenance corridor. It runs inside the cliff face. Cuts behind the seawall. It was built in the 1970s. It's not on any civilian map. I've been in it twice for environmental assessments. Can you navigate it now?" "Yes." "How long does it add?" 12 minutes. "Maybe 15. Keene and Claire looked at each other. Something passed between them, not an agreement, not a peace, but a recognition. "Take us there," Claire said to Ortiz. They were halfway through the maintenance corridor, a narrow, low-ceilinged tunnel cut into the rock by a generation of engineers who had been building something meant to last when Commander Harrow went down. Not all at once. He stumbled first, caught himself against the tunnel wall, and then Claire saw his face in the beam of a headlamp and knew immediately. "Harrow," she said. "I'm fine," he said. He was not fine. The section of old seawall they had skirted had saved them from wave action, but deposited them on wet rock. And Harrow had taken a hard slip that he hadn't reported. His left leg had taken the impact. Dunn was beside him within 20 seconds, hands moving with the practiced precision of a field medic. "Pressing, testing, reading. Probable fracture," Dunn said quietly. "Midshaft tibia. He can bear weight but not combat pace." Harrow's face was white and controlled. He looked at Claire. "Lieutenant Rourke," he said. And his voice was clear, steady, and completely deliberate. "You have the team." The tunnel went quiet, except for the wind carrying through it from somewhere ahead. Claire looked at Harrow. Then she looked at the team at Keene, who was watching her from the rear, at Dunn, who was taping Harrow's leg with calm efficiency, at the 9 civilians arranged along the tunnel wall, watching her with the specific attention of people whose survival now depended on whatever she said next. She thought of Keene's words in the staging bay at Fort Sable. "She's the weakest link." She thought of Harrow's words in the empty briefing room. "I need to know you're prepared to act on that, not just receive it." She took one breath. "Here's how this works," she said. And her voice carried through the tunnel with the particular quality of certainty, not loudness, not performance, just the sound of a person who knows what the next hour requires. "Dunn, you stabilize Commander Harrow and Walsh, and you stay with them in the rear element. Keene, you take point. I want your eyes on what's ahead of us. Torres Mac, you're with the civilians. 2 of you to Walsh's position on rotation." She paused. "Dr. Ortiz, I need you up front with Keene. You know this terrain and he doesn't." Ortiz nodded. She was already moving. Claire looked at Keene. Keene looked back. Something in his face had shifted, not softened, not conceded, but repositioned. He gave her a single nod. They moved. When they finally saw the lifeboat station, through the rain and spray at the mouth of the maintenance corridor, Walsh's ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and he had stopped trying to hide the pain of it. Harrow was moving on one leg with a makeshift splint and Torres's shoulder. 3 of the 9 civilians had passed the point where encouragement helped and were now simply moving because stopping was worse. But they were moving. Claire counted them as she brought up the rear. 9 civilians, 6 operators, 1 commander injured, 1 civilian engineer injured, 17 people, all of them still moving. She looked at the lifeboat station through the rain and thought about the next problem, because there was always a next problem. And the difference between a planner and a dreamer was knowing that the arrival was never the ending. She already suspected what the next problem was. She was right. But that was a problem for the next 60 seconds. For this one, she kept moving. The lifeboat station smelled like rust, salt, and something older, the particular decay of a building that had been built to matter and then abandoned before it got the chance. Claire moved through the entrance with Walsh's arm over her shoulder, the last of the 17 people to cross the threshold, and immediately registered the 3 things she needed to know. The structure was holding, the roof was intact over the central bay, and the maritime guidance beacon on the eastern wall was dark. That last fact settled into her chest like a stone. She had time to be concerned about it in approximate 40 seconds. First, she needed to get Harrow onto a flat surface, get Walsh's ankle elevated, and get a head count that she could confirm with her own eyes rather than her memory. Done, she said. Harrow first, then Walsh. Use the equipment crates on the north wall, they're the flattest surface in here. Dunn was already moving. She counted 9 civilians, 6 operators including herself. Harrow conscious, alert, managing the pain with the compressed expression of a man who had been injured before and knew that the injury did not get to run the meeting. Walsh pale, sweating, his broken ankle finally elevated on a coil of old rope that Ortiz had found without being asked to find it. 17. All 17. Claire let herself have exactly 2 seconds of something that wasn't quite relief, because relief implied the threat was over. And the threat was not over, and then she turned to the beacon. Keene was already standing in front of it. He had his headlamp on it, his hands on it, and the specific expression of a man who had arrived at a problem he needed to solve, and was in the process of determining whether he could solve it. He turned to Claire when she approached. "It's not just dark," he said. "The power coupling is cracked. The backup battery circuit is corroded through. This thing hasn't been active in," he looked at the grime on his hands, "years. Can you restore it?" "Not with what I'm carrying," he paused. "Maybe. If there are parts in the maintenance locker." "Find the maintenance locker," Claire said. Keene went. He took Torres with him, and they moved along the interior wall, testing doors, and Claire turned to her radio. The long-range communications unit had taken water in the maintenance corridor, not submersion, but sustained spray in a confined space, and the result was what it usually was when electronics met ocean air at the wrong moment. She keyed the transmitter 3 times, listened to the static, adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing clean. Fragments of carrier signal, no voice, no confirmation that anything was reaching the maritime extraction unit that was somewhere out in the deteriorating North Pacific, waiting for their signal. She set the radio on the equipment crate beside Harrow and looked at him. "What's our window?" he asked. He already knew the situation. He had been watching her work through it, but asking the question was a way of helping her organize it aloud. "The cyclone's outer bands are already here," Claire said. "Full force landfall, I estimate 4 hours. Maritime extraction needs the beacon to navigate the reef without it. The rescue craft can't approach within safety margin. Radio's compromised." She paused, "and the harbor group has had enough time since we left the research station to reposition. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about the engineer," she said. Garrett Walsh looked up from the crate where his ankle was elevated. He was 31, wiry, with the specific pallor of someone managing serious pain through concentration rather than comfort. His face, when he heard the word engineer, shifted into something more alert than it had been 30 seconds ago. "Me," he said. "You," Claire said. She moved to where he was and crouched so they were at eye level. "Dr. Ortiz told me during the crossing that you worked coastal infrastructure before relief work. Harbor guidance systems, port lighting." Walsh blinked. "That was 12 years ago. But you know the principles." "I know, yes. I know the principles. Guidance beacons aren't complicated. The technology is 60 years old. They're designed to be repaired by anyone with." He stopped. His eyes went to his ankle. "By anyone who can stand up." "I'll stand," Claire said. "You'll think. Can you do that?" Walsh looked at her for a moment. She could see him running the actual calculation, not the polite refusal that the situation seemed to invite, not the reasonable objection that he was injured, but the real engineering question. "Is this possible?" His expression changed as the calculation resolved itself. "I need to see what's in the maintenance locker," he said. "Keene's on it," Claire said. "You get there when Dunn says you can move." She stood. Ortiz was at her elbow. She had moved with a quietness that Claire was coming to recognize as characteristic. "The harbor group," Ortiz said, not asking. "You anticipated that. I've been on this island for 4 days. I know how fast they move." Ortiz looked toward the sealed exterior door. "They had boats in the harbor. If they moved south when we left the station, they'll have people on the coastal path in under an hour. This building sits at the base of the eastern cliffs. There's only one approach from the land side, which is what I'll tell Keene," Claire said. "Is there anything about the approach that's not obvious from the exterior? Something that would give a defending position an advantage?" Ortiz thought. "There's a water collection tank on the north side of the building. It's concrete, it's elevated, and it sits at the top of the approach slope. From there you can see the path for about 100 meters before it reaches the building." Claire nodded. "Thank you. You're good at this," Ortiz said. It wasn't a compliment delivered for comfort. It was an observation stated like a data point. "I've had time to think about it," Claire said. And moved. Keene and Torres had found the maintenance locker. It was along the west wall behind a corroded handle that required a screwdriver to force. Torres provided the screwdriver. The handle provided resistance, and eventually the locker provided what was inside it. A half-century of accumulated spare parts, sealed in various states of usefulness. Some of it was useless, some of it was marginal, and on the second shelf, sealed in the original factory packaging in the way that whoever had stocked this station had been very careful about one specific category of supply, were 2 replacement power coupling units, compatible with the beacon's generation of hardware. Keene held one up when Claire arrived. "Tell me that's what I think it is," she said. "Compatible coupling," Keene said. "It's old, but it's sealed. Might work." He looked at her. "Walsh needs to confirm the installation before we touch anything. That beacon's wiring is original. If we short something, we lose the whole unit." "I know," Claire said. "We wait for Walsh." There was a pause, the practical flow of the situation, 30 seconds. Maybe, while Dunn prepared Walsh for movement, and the wind outside escalated to the particular register that meant the storm's outer structure was fully present and the center was coming. In that pause, Keene said, "You asked Ortiz about the approach path." "Yes." "You were already thinking about defensive position before I got back here." "Yes." He looked at her. Not the look he had given her in the staging bay at Fort Sable, not the measuring look of a man waiting for something to fail. Something different, something that was happening in real time as the situation revised his assumptions. "The water tank on the north side," he said. "Ortiz mentioned it. I saw it coming in. Elevated, clear sightline down the approach." He paused. "You want me there?" "I want you there with Mac and Chen," Claire said. "I want 45 minutes warning before anyone reaches that door. Whatever comes after that, we'll have the beacon working, or we won't. And we'll deal with what we have." Keene looked at her for one more moment. Then he picked up his weapon, signaled Mac and Chen, and moved toward the exterior access. He stopped at the door. "Rourke," he said without turning. "Yeah." The seawall passage, a pause. "You caught it before we went in. You corrected it. That cost 12 minutes and it was still the right call." He pushed the door open, and the storm came in briefly, loud and wet and immediate, before the door swung shut behind him and the team. Claire stood in the sudden relative quiet of the interior and let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to, which was not long, and then Walsh called her name from across the room and it was time to work on the beacon. The installation took 31 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. Walsh could not stand, so Claire stood. He could not use both hands on the coupling unit because his position on the improvised cot made the reach impossible. So Claire used her hands and Walsh directed them right half turn. "Counter 3 degrees. Feel the seating. Don't force it. There, hold that." He talked her through the connection points, the way an engineer talked to a technician who had all the necessary fine motor function, but none of the background knowledge which was exactly what Claire was in that moment, and she found herself respecting the precision of it. He did not assume she would understand abbreviations. He did not repeat himself unnecessarily. He said what needed to be said and stopped when it was said. The corroded backup battery circuit was the problem that couldn't be solved with the replacement coupling alone. Walsh stared at it from his cot for 4 minutes before he said, "There's a way. It's not elegant." "I don't need elegant," Claire said. "It means bypassing the corrosion point entirely and running direct from the emergency power line on the east wall. The beacon wasn't designed for it, but the draw is low enough that it should hold." Should, Walsh confirmed. "In my professional opinion, probably yes. In the real world, where this equipment is 40 years old and hasn't been maintained, and we're running it during a cyclone." "Your guess is as good as mine. Then we try it," Claire said. They tried it. The bypass took another 9 minutes. Claire's hands worked under Walsh's instruction, stripping wire casing with a multi-tool, connecting with the electrical tape from the emergency kit that Dunn produced without being asked, routing the line through the path Walsh specified. Her shoulder ached, not the grinding warning of the rehearsal, but the dull, persistent complaint of sustained work in a bad position, the kind of pain she had learned to negotiate with rather than ignore. She finished the bypass. Walsh told her to throw the emergency power breaker on the east wall. She threw it. The beacon lit up, not brilliantly, not the definitive blaze of something working perfectly. A steady, medium-intensity light that pulsed in the pattern specified for this section of the reef, the pattern that the Maritime extraction crew would have in their navigation data. The pattern that would tell a rescue craft where the safe approach corridor was in conditions that made the reef itself invisible. Ortiz from across the room said quietly, "It's working." Claire looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then she went to the radio. The Maritime extraction frequency was still noisy, but the beacon's activation had given the rescue craft a position to navigate toward, and positions gave radio operators something to triangulate. It took 4 attempts and a lot of static before a voice came through broken, layered under interference, but unmistakably a human voice using the right authentication codes. "Extraction craft inbound. Estimated arrival 40 to 50 minutes, depending on sea state. Stand by the eastern shore." Claire confirmed receipt and looked at Harrow. 40 to 50 minutes, she said. Harrow's expression was unreadable, but his color was slightly better than it had been 30 minutes ago. Dunn had managed his pain and stabilized his leg. "Then we just have to hold the building for 40 minutes. Keene's on the approach path," Claire said. 40 minutes is manageable. She had said it with more confidence than she strictly felt, because 40 minutes in a deteriorating building on an exposed coastline, with an armed group closing from the inland path and a cyclone arriving from the sea, was not simply manageable. It was a calculation, and the calculation had variables she couldn't fully control. But Harrow didn't need her uncertainty right now. He needed her to hold the room together. She held it. 22 minutes later, Keene's voice came over the short-range radio. "We've got contact on the approach path. I count 4. Possibly 5 individuals. Armed. They're moving cautiously. They don't know exactly what they're walking toward." A pause. "But they're coming." Claire keyed back. "How long at this pace?" 12 minutes to the building. 12 minutes, and an extraction vessel that was now 28 to 38 minutes away. The gap was 16 to 26 minutes, and it was not going to close itself. She looked at the room. Dunn was between the 2 injured men. 6 civilians had moved to the back wall, with the remaining 3 operators providing coverage. Ortiz was on her feet near the beacon, watching it as though she could keep it running through attention alone. Claire keyed the radio again. "Keene, can you slow them without engagement?" A pause. The kind of pause that contained a specific technical assessment. "The terrain on the approach gives us one option. There's a secondary drainage channel running parallel to the path. It's fast-moving tonight. It's swollen, and if they go off the path into it, they're going to have a very bad time. I can't push them into it, but I can make the path less appealing." "Do it," Claire said. You understand that means expending. I understand the resource cost. Do it. Another pause. Understood. She turned back to the room and found Ortiz watching her. You bought time, Ortiz said. I bought some, Claire said. We need more. The beacon, Ortiz said. If they reach the building and they see the light, they know there's an extraction coming. That's what they'll try to shut down first. I know. So what happens to Walsh if we have to move him away from the beacon position? It was the right question. And it was also the question that had no clean answer. Walsh had done everything that be asked of him in this building. His ankle was broken. His pain management was pharmacological. And moving him again under fire, and in this weather, was a serious medical decision, one that Dunn would have to make and that Claire would have to support or override. She went to Dunn. If we have to move before extraction arrives, she said. Directly and low, Walsh's medical status, give it to me straight. Dunn didn't waste time on preamble. He can be moved. It's going to cost him. The bone is displaced enough that movement under stress carries re-injury risk and significant pain. I can't sedate him enough to eliminate that without compromising his ability to cooperate with movement, which makes everything harder. He held her eyes. You want my honest assessment? That's what I'm here for. Moving him is safer than leaving him, Dunn said. Whatever the extraction situation looks like, he comes with us. The risk of leaving him here in any scenario where we have to fight through those people is not acceptable. Agreed, Claire said. She had already been thinking the same thing, but she had wanted Dunn's assessment to confirm it rather than her assumption to drive it. That was the difference between a plan that came from one person's certainty and a plan that came from using the expertise in the room. Plan for carrying him if necessary. Already thought about it, Dunn said. The next 8 minutes compressed into the kind of time that combat situations generated moments that felt longer than their clocks, where the mind operated in a state of simultaneous awareness of too many things at once and had to be continuously disciplined. Back to the priority sequence. Claire monitored the short-range radio, tracked the beacon, checked on Harrow, maintained awareness of the door, and held an ongoing internal assessment of the extraction timeline that she updated every 2 minutes. Keene's team had slowed the approach group. They had not stopped them. At the 9-minute mark, Keene's voice returned on the radio. They've reconfigured. 2 are trying to flank south, around the water tank. I've got eyes on them, but I can't maintain position on the main approach and cover the flank simultaneously with 3 people. Pull back to the building, Claire said immediately. All 3 now. If we leave the approach path, I know what we lose. Pull back. The calculation was simple and terrible. 3 operators spread across 2 threat vectors in deteriorating conditions were less effective than 3 operators consolidated in a single defensive structure. She needed Keene's team inside the building, covering the single door, with everyone accounted for and the beacon running until the extraction craft reached the reef. It was the correct decision. She knew it was the correct decision. The part of her that still heard Travis Keene's voice from the staging bay at Fort Sable, she'll be the reason someone doesn't come home, tried to add itself to the calculation, and she declined the addition. This was not about her. This was about 17 people, and a light on a reef and a boat in the storm. Keene pulled back. His team came through the exterior door 40 seconds later, wet and hard-faced, and immediately reorganizing to the interior position without being told. Keene found Claire in the middle of the room. South flank is uncontested, he said. I know. If they move fast, they'll reach the south exterior in under 4 minutes, Claire said. Which is why I need you and Torres on the interior south wall, covering the single access point on that side. Mac and Chen hold the main door. She paused. The extraction crew is approximately 18 minutes out. Keene absorbed that. 18 minutes. 4 minutes to contact on the south wall. 14 minutes where the building would be contested. Harrow, he said. Stable, Claire said. Dunn's got him. Keene looked at her. Something passed through his face that was complicated, too complicated to name in the middle of a contested building on a cyclone-struck island. He simply said, "Tell me where you want me, South Wall," she said. "And Keene, if the south access goes, you do not hold position. You fall back to the central bay. We consolidate and we wait for the boat." "Understood." He moved. The next 14 minutes were the kind that people who had been in them later struggled to describe to people who hadn't, not because the events were impossible to recount, but because the texture of it, the way time operated under sustained threat with insufficient resources, the way the mind held 17 simultaneous concerns and had to keep choosing which one to act on, was not a thing that language fully captured. Claire held the room. She held it the way she held the beacon's installation, by being the person in the center who connected all the moving pieces, who received information from every corner and converted it into decisions, who kept the civilians calm by being calm herself, who kept the operators effective by giving them clear direction and then trusting them to execute it. The south access was tested twice. It held both times. The main door was approached once, and Mac and Chen's presence was sufficient to deter without escalation. And then the extraction radio crackled. "Rescue craft on approach. Beacon confirmed. Initiating reef passage. Stand by on eastern shore." Ortiz, standing at the beacon, closed her eyes briefly. Walsh, from his cot, let out a long breath that had probably been held for longer than he knew. Claire keyed the radio. "All units, extraction in progress. Prepare to move. Civilian priority, injured personnel priority. Operators form exterior cover." "Keene already on it," Keene said. The movement to the eastern shore took 6 minutes. The beach was narrow, and the surf was brutal, the storm's full weight arriving in the waves that struck the rocks below. But the reef passage was exactly where Walsh and Claire had lit it, and the rescue craft came through it with the specific controlled authority of a crew that had practiced this approach and knew exactly where the margin was. The civilians went first. Claire counted them across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All 9. Ortiz went last among the civilians, with Walsh's case of medical records that she had never once set down since she picked it up at the research station. Harrow went next, done beside him, managed with the care that a man with a fractured tibia required on an uneven shore in heavy surf. Walsh carried on the emergency litter that Dunn had prepared, went across with 3 operators managing the transfer. The operators went next. Torres, Mac, Chen, then Dunn after he confirmed Walsh was stable on the craft. That left Claire and Keene on the shore. He hadn't left. She was aware of that, had been aware of it, while she managed the boarding sequence. The specific fact that Travis Keene, who had 17 years of seniority and every reason to get himself onto the rescue craft before the situation got worse, was standing at her shoulder instead. She looked at him. "You should be on the boat," she said. "So should you," he said. "I'm counting personnel. I'm covering the count." She looked at him for a moment in the wind and the spray. With the lights of the rescue craft cutting through the dark 20 meters away, and she understood that something had shifted between them that she had not engineered and had not expected, and could not fully measure in the middle of an eastern island shore in a cyclone. She turned back to the boarding. "Count's complete," she said. "We go." They went. The wave that hit the shore behind them as they reached the craft's extended boarding platform was larger than anything that had come before the advance signature of the storm's main body. The physical announcement that the island's window had closed. It struck the rocks where they had been standing with a force that sent spray 20 feet up the cliff face. Claire grabbed the boarding rail with both hands. Her right shoulder protested not locking. Not the grinding of the rehearsal, but the honest complaint of a joint that had done more than it was ready for, and knew it. She pulled herself up anyway, because the alternative was not an option, and because the shoulder was hers, and the people on the craft were all 17 accounted for, and that was the only number that mattered. She made the rail, she made the deck. Keene was behind her. He reached the deck 1 second after her and turned immediately to look back at the shore. The lifeboat station was still showing its light. Walsh's beacon, running on bypassed emergency power, pulsing its pattern into the dark. The craft's crew was already beginning the reverse through the reef passage. Keene watched the shore until it disappeared. Then he turned around and sat down on the deck opposite Commander Harrow, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Claire stood at the stern and watched the island go. She watched it the way she had watched her contingency plans during the crossing that morning, looking for what she had missed, what she had gotten right, what the situation had taught her that her planning hadn't anticipated. The seawall passage. The 40-minute estimate on the approach group that had compressed to 22. The bypass solution that Walsh had found when she asked the right person the right question. She would write all of it down. She would write the correct decisions and the incorrect ones. She would write the seawall passage and the 12 minutes it cost and the reason it had still been the right correction. That was the document that would go into the review, not a polished account of a plan that executed flawlessly, but an accurate account of a plan that adapted to a reality that planning couldn't fully anticipate. And that had brought 17 people off a storm-struck island because the person commanding it had been willing to ask for help and willing to admit when she was wrong. The rescue craft cleared the reef. The open Pacific received them, rough and indifferent and cold, and the 17 people on the deck of that vessel were alive to experience its indifference. Claire sat down, her shoulder hurt. She let it. The rescue craft docked at Naval Station Puget Sound at 3:47 in the morning. And the first thing Claire heard when the gangway went down was the sound of medical teams organized. Urgent. The controlled noise of people who had been waiting and were now moving with purpose. She stepped aside to let them work. That was the correct thing to do. The medical teams had a job, and her job at this moment was to not be in the way of it. Harrow went off on a gurney, conscious, still giving instructions to the receiving officer until someone politely told him that the instructions could wait until he was out of surgery. Walsh went off on a second gurney, grimacing, with Dunn walking beside him, reciting the injury particulars to the trauma nurse in the clipped, precise shorthand of a field medic handing off a patient. The 9 civilians went off in a cluster, wrapped in emergency blankets, guided by base personnel who had been briefed on their condition and their names. Ortiz stopped at the bottom of the gangway and turned back. Claire was still on the deck, doing her head count one final time. It was unnecessary. She had counted 17 getting on, and 17 had gotten off, but she did it anyway. Because the discipline of verification was what separated the people who came home from the people who didn't. And she was not going to abandon the discipline just because the crisis had passed. Ortiz waited for her. "You didn't have to do that," Claire said when she reached the dock. She meant wait. "I know," Ortiz said. She held out her hand. Claire took it. The grip was firm and direct, the handshake of a person who meant the gesture rather than performing it. "What you did on that island was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Ortiz considered the question seriously, which Claire appreciated. "I expected someone trying to prove something. That's usually what you get when there's something to prove." She paused. "You weren't trying to prove anything. You were just working the problem." Claire held that for a moment. That's all it was. That's all it needed to be. Ortiz picked up her records case, which had been at her feet throughout the conversation. "The contamination data. I'll submit the full report within 48 hours. But the drinking water situation on Grayhaven is real, and it's urgent. Make sure that goes up the chain." "I'll make sure," Claire said. Ortiz nodded once and walked off the dock. Keene was sitting on a bollard 15 feet away. He had been sitting there since he came off the gangway, his gear at his feet, not moving. Claire walked to him. She did not have a plan for this conversation. She had learned that some conversations worked better without a plan. He looked up when she stopped in front of him. "Surgery," he said. "For Harrow?" "Yes, Dunn says the fracture is clean. He'll recover." Keene nodded. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "Walsh's ankle is going to need plates." "Probably," Claire said. He already knew that before tonight. He did the beacon work anyway. He did. Keene was quiet for a moment. The dock was alive around them, personnel moving, equipment being offloaded, the organized aftermath of an operation that had come home, but the 15 feet around Keene and Claire seemed to exist in a slightly different register. Quieter, slower. "I want to say something," Keene said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His jaw tightened briefly. "That's not why I'm going to say it." He looked at her directly. "I spent 3 weeks building a case against you. Not because of your shoulder. I told myself it was about your shoulder. But that wasn't it. It was because you were coming back into a team I'd spent 4 years holding together. And you were coming back as the alternate commander over people who'd been doing this the whole time you were in surgery." He paused. "That felt wrong to me. So I made it wrong. I made it your problem instead of mine." Claire let him finish. "On the island," he continued, "I watched you work. I watched you ask Ortiz for the maintenance corridor instead of pretending you knew a route you didn't know. I watched you tell us the seawall was wrong the second you saw it. Without covering yourself, without making it complicated. I watched you run a building defense with 17 people in it and keep every one of them moving in the right direction." He looked away briefly. "I've commanded operations. Not all of them looked like that. Some of them did," Claire said. "Some of them did," he agreed. "But not because of me." He stood up. He was taller than her by 6 inches and built like something structural. And he looked at her with an expression that had shed the hardness she had been seeing for 3 weeks and replaced it with something more difficult, the look of a man who was in the process of revising a belief he had held confidently and finding the revision uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. "I was wrong about you. That's what I wanted to say." Claire held his eyes for a moment. "I know," she said. "I also know it's going to take more than one mission for that to change how this team operates. And I know you know that too." She paused. "So let's figure out what comes next." Keene was quiet for a beat. Then he picked up his gear. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do that." They walked off the dock together. Not in solidarity exactly, that would come later. Or it wouldn't, but in the practical proximity of two people who had been through something real and were still working out what it meant. The debrief started at 600 and ran for 4 hours. It was conducted by Commander James Harrow's superior, Admiral Patricia Voss, who was 61 and had the specific energy of a person who had been awake for a very long time and had no intention of letting that affect the quality of her questions. She ran the debrief from a conference room at the naval station, with a recording team, a legal observer, and a mission analysis officer who took notes with the focused intensity of someone whose job was to find the precise moment where something went right and the precise moment where something went wrong, and to distinguish between those moments clearly enough that the next team could learn from both. Claire sat at the table for the full 4 hours. Keene sat beside her. The rest of the team rotated in and out as Voss called for them. Voss was not interested in heroics. She was interested in sequence, in decision logic, in the gap between the approved plan and the executed plan, and every specific reason that gap existed. She asked about the abandoned LZ with the precision of someone who already knew the answer and wanted to hear how Claire characterized her own decision-making. She asked about the seawall passage the same way. She asked about the command transfer from Harrow in the maintenance corridor, about the beacon restoration, about the defensive consolidation in the final 14 minutes. She did not make any of it easy. "Walk me through the seawall decision," Voss said. "At the 2-hour mark, your own route. You had surveilled it. You had flagged it as a concern in your planning notes. And then you committed to it without the current tide data you had identified as a prerequisite. How do you characterize that?" Claire did not pause. "An error in execution," she said. "I had the right concern at the planning stage. Under time pressure, I allowed the concern to be deprioritized without adequately substituting for the missing data. The result was a 12-minute detour and an unnecessary stress on the team at a point when we were already behind the weather." Voss made a note. "And you self-corrected immediately upon observing the situation." Yes. Did the correction require assistance? Yes. Dr. Ortiz provided the alternative route. The correction was a collaborative product. Voss looked at her for a moment. Lieutenant, some officers in your position, with the pressure that existed in that room before the operation and the performance you had just turned in, would characterize the seawall error differently, would describe it as an unavoidable consequence of imperfect intelligence, rather than a planning error. Some officers would, Claire said. That characterization would be inaccurate. Voss held her gaze. Then she made another note and moved on. At the 4-hour mark, Voss closed her notebook and looked at the table generally. Preliminary assessment, she said. The approved extraction route was compromised by the surveillance presence at the northern LZ. Recovered intelligence confirms the surveillance was placed not less than 6 hours before the team's arrival, indicating the operation had a security breach at the planning level that is not attributable to anyone in this room. She paused. The contingency route executed by Lieutenant Rourke produced 0 civilian casualties, 0 operator fatalities, and exfiltrated all 17 persons from a compromised area under cyclone conditions, with 2 injured personnel. She looked at Claire. The alternate route saved this operation. That will be the finding. The room was quiet. Then Voss looked at Keene, Chief Petty Officer Keene. I want to discuss the pre-mission remarks at Fort Sable. Keene straightened. You stated publicly, in front of junior operators, that Lieutenant Rourke was your word the weakest link. That her presence would result in casualties. Yes, ma'am. That statement was recorded in the staging area system. It has been reviewed. Voss's voice carried no anger. It was worse than anger. It was the flat assessment of someone who had spent 40 years watching the specific damage that senior personnel inflicted on unit cohesion when they believed their seniority entitled them to public contempt. Chief Petty Officer, whatever your operational concerns about Lieutenant Rourke's fitness, and I understand that concerns existed, that statement was not a professional observation. It was a performance. And it was a performance directed at junior operators who are still forming their understanding of what good leadership looks like. She let that sit. We will discuss the consequences of that at a separate session. For now, I want you to understand that the consequence structure has already been determined, and it is not negotiable. Keene's face was still. Understood, ma'am. Good, Voss stood. This debrief is closed. All personnel are on restricted rest for the next 24 hours. Nobody talks to media. Nobody talks to family in operational specifics. Medical updates on Commander Harrow and Petty Officer Walsh will be provided through official channels. She looked at the room one final time. You brought them all home. That counts for a great deal, and she left. The room took a breath. Torres looked at the ceiling. Mac exhaled something that might have been a laugh or might have been relief. It was difficult to distinguish between them after 4 hours of debrief. Chen was already on his feet, heading for the door with the purposefulness of a man who needed 24 hours of sleep and intended to start immediately. Claire sat for a moment after the others began moving. Her shoulder had stiffened in the 4 hours since the dock. Not severely, not the grinding of the rehearsal, not the warning of the harness moment, but the kind of deep, accumulated stiffness that told her the injury had done more work than it was ready for. And the account was coming due. She knew what the medical assessment would find. She knew what it would mean for her operational timeline. She had known this, she realized, since about the moment she grabbed the boarding rail on the rescue craft. She had made a choice in that moment, not a dramatic or deliberate one. Just the choice that the situation presented, and that she executed because the alternative was not an option, and her shoulder had been part of the cost. She accepted it the way she accepted the seawall error, clearly, accurately, without making it into something it wasn't. Keene stopped beside her chair. The preliminary finding, he said. How did you know Voss would get there? I didn't, Claire said. The intelligence confirmation about the LZ surveillance helped. But I didn't know. I just knew that the correct account of what happened was the only account I was willing to give, And whatever the finding was, I was going to have to live with having given it. Keene looked at her for a moment. You weren't covering yourself. No. Most people would have. Most people also don't get to use Dr. Ortiz maintenance corridor, Claire said. The two things are related. Keene processed that. She could see him, working through it, connecting the intellectual honesty of the debrief account to the operational pattern that had produced it. Understanding that the same quality that made her admit the seawall error clearly in a formal review was the quality that had made her ask Ortiz for a route she didn't know rather than committing to a wrong one. It was the same trait operating in different contexts. Keene was the kind of man who, once he understood something, understood it fully. He put on his jacket. Medical assessment is at 1400. I know, Claire said. Your shoulder, I know, she said again. Not defensively. Just acknowledging the fact. Keene hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, I'll be giving the same account. At my session with Voss, he met her eyes. The same account. Exactly. What happened at Fort Sable, and what happened on that island. No adjustments. I didn't expect any different, Claire said. He left. She sat alone in the conference room for 60 more seconds, doing the thing she had been doing since they cleared the reef, running the sequence. Identifying the junctions, understanding where the plan had held and where it had bent, where it had broken and been rebuilt from what was available. This was not self-criticism. It was the work that nobody saw because it happened internally, in the space between events, where a planner lived. The beacon restoration had been the closest call. Walsh's solution had been non-standard, and Walsh had said so openly. And if the bypass had failed, the extraction craft would have had no reliable navigation reference, and the 38-minute window would have become something much more complicated. Claire had made the call to attempt the bypass because the alternative no beacon, no reliable extraction was categorically worse. But it had been a decision made with incomplete certainty, and she was honest enough with herself to name it that way. Not every call was going to be right. That was not the standard. The standard was, did you use what you had? Did you ask the right people for what you didn't have? Did you correct when the situation told you to correct? And did you keep going? She had. 17 people had. That was the answer. She stood up, collected her notes, and went to find a phone to call her mother. It was, she thought, a deeply human thing to want to do after all of that. To have extracted 17 people from a cyclone-struck island and sat through 4 hours of formal review and have the first private desire be to hear a familiar voice. She did not try to make it more significant than it was. She just found the phone and made the call, and when her mother answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting, Claire said, "Hi, I'm okay. I'll tell you about it later," and meant both of those things completely. The medical assessment at 1,400 confirmed what Claire's shoulder had been telling her since the boarding rail. The joint had sustained micro-tears in the reconstructed tissue, not a re-rupture. Not a surgical emergency, but sufficient damage to the repair work that her return timeline was going to extend significantly. The assessment physician, a Navy orthopedist named Dr. Carla Reyes, who had the manner of a person who dealt in facts because facts were what helped, laid it out without softening. The repair is intact, Reyes said. You didn't undo the surgery. But the micro-tear pattern indicates sustained overload. The joint was performing above its current recovery threshold for an extended period. We're looking at a minimum of 4 additional months of rehabilitation before we can reassess operational readiness. 4 months, Claire said. Minimum, possibly 5. It depends how the tissue responds to the treatment protocol. Reyes looked at her steadily. I can write it softer than that if it helps. But it wouldn't be accurate. It doesn't help, Claire said. Write it accurately. She sat with the assessment form in the waiting area afterward, and did not perform a reaction that she didn't feel. She was disappointed, of course she was disappointed. She had come back to operational status through 8 months of work, and a return to Grayhaven, and she was not going back immediately. That was real, and it was worth naming. But she was also aware that she was sitting in a naval station waiting area with the correct count of 17 having come home, and that the shoulder had performed above its threshold and produced the right outcome, and that the 4 months were a cost she had chosen when she grabbed the boarding rail. She chose it again, sitting in the waiting area. She would have chosen it a third time. Dunn found her there 20 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee that were both terrible in the specific way that institutional coffee was terrible, and sat down beside her. "Reyes get to you yet?" he asked. 4 months minimum, Claire said. She accepted the coffee. It was bad, and it was warm, and it was welcome, I figured. Dunn looked at the wall in front of them. "You know Walsh is asking about you. Walsh should be resting. Walsh is Walsh. He wants to know if the beacon data was useful to the extraction crew. I think he's running a post-operation engineering assessment from his hospital bed." Dunn looked at her sidelong. "He also said the bypass solution was textbook, that you had better hands than he expected." Claire looked at the coffee cup. "Tell him the beacon data was confirmed useful. The extraction crew had it in their navigation record. I will." Dunn was quiet for a moment. "You're going to be okay, you know." "I know. 4 months isn't permanent. I know that too." He held his bad coffee, and she held hers, and they sat in the institutional quiet of the waiting area, and that was enough. Claire had learned, in the months of rehabilitation before this mission, that some moments did not require conversation to fill them. Dunn apparently knew the same thing, because he didn't reach for conversation that wasn't needed. They simply sat together, 2 people who had been through something real and were in the specific, unremarkable aftermath of it, tired, sore, alive, thinking. After a while, Claire said, "The security breach." "Yeah," Dunn said. "The LZ surveillance placed 6 hours before we arrived. Someone knew the approved route. Someone with access to the planning documents. Above the level of this team." Dunn looked at her. Voss mentioned it as not attributable to anyone in this room. She was right. But she said it carefully. She says everything carefully, Claire said. This she said more carefully than usual. He paused. "It's going to be an investigation. A serious one." "Yes," Claire said. "And it should be." She drank her coffee. "And it has nothing to do with the next 4 months." "No," Dunn agreed. "It doesn't." The corridor outside the waiting area was busy with the consternation of a working naval installation personnel, moving with purpose. Equipment being staged and catalogued, the unglamorous machinery of military operations running in every direction. Claire watched it for a while. Then she pulled out the notes she had made during the crossing from Grayhaven and looked at the section she had labeled Contingency Corrections. There were 6 items. 3 she had handled correctly under pressure. 2 she had handled adequately. 1 the seawall she had handled incorrectly and corrected. She wrote a 7th item at the bottom of the list. Security protocol for approved route documentation. With a question mark beside it, because she did not yet know the answer, but she knew the question needed to be asked. That was, she thought, what the next 4 months were for. Not waiting. Not enduring. Working on the problems that could be worked on from a desk and a therapy room and a planning table. Building the framework that the team would need when she came back. And making the questions answerable before the next operation put them to the test in conditions that did not allow for 12-minute detours and maintenance locker spare parts. She put the notes away. Her coffee was cold. She drank the rest of it anyway. Because waste was waste. And she stood up, and she went to find Commander Harrow's room to check on him before the restricted rest period officially began. He was post-surgery in the recovery room with the specific gray-faced alertness of someone who had been under anesthetic and was now fighting their way back to full consciousness with the dogged stubbornness that defined him as a person. He saw Claire come in, and his expression shifted not to relief, not to sentimentality, but to the focused attention of a man for whom being conscious was something you used. 17, he said. His voice was still rough from the anesthetic. All 17, Claire said. He held her eyes for a moment. Whatever he was looking for, he found it, because he settled back slightly against the pillow a fraction, barely perceptible, and something in his face released. The security breach, he said. Voss is on it. Good. She'll find it. He paused. Your shoulder. 4 months minimum. He absorbed that without changing his expression. And you're going to spend 4 months redesigning the contingency extraction program. That's my current plan, she said. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. You know what you did on that island. I know what the team did, Claire said. He shook his head, very slightly. Don't do that. I've seen people disappear their own work into team credit, when the team credit was real. I've also seen people use it as a reflex to avoid owning a correct decision. Know the difference? He held her eyes. You made the calls that brought 17 people home. That's yours. Own it the same way you owned the seawall. Claire stood with that for a moment. Yes, sir, she said. Good. He closed his eyes briefly. The anesthetic was still pulling at him. Go get some sleep. Lieutenant, 4 hours of Voss and a medical assessment is enough for one day. She almost smiled. Yes, sir. She was at the door when he spoke again. Without opening his eyes, Rourke, sir, the team's going to need what you're building, he said. Don't let the 4 months make you small. She stood in the doorway for a moment. No, sir, she said, I won't. She walked out into the corridor, into the organized motion of the naval station, into the beginning of the next 4 months. Carrying the weight of everything that had happened, and the specific knowledge that the weight was not a burden she had failed to put down, it was the kind she had chosen to carry. Because carrying it meant something, because the lesson of Grayhaven Island was not that she had survived it, but that 17 people had. And the difference between those two facts was the work she had done in the 10 days before the operation and the decisions she had made in the hours during it. The weakest link, she thought. No, that was not what she was. She knew what she was. She had demonstrated it in the only language that mattered in the outcome. In the account, in the correction, in the question at the bottom of the list that still needed an answer. She kept walking. The formal mission review board convened 17 days after Operation Safe Tide, in a conference room at Naval Station Puget Sound that smelled like old coffee and the particular institutional neutrality of rooms where serious things were decided. Claire sat on one side of the table. 3 senior officers sat on the other. Admiral Voss was not present. She had recused herself after conducting the initial debrief, which was the correct procedure, and also, Claire suspected, a deliberate signal that the board would operate without the weight of Voss's preliminary assessment pressing on its conclusions. The board's senior member was a rear admiral named Cole, who was 56 and had the specific patience of someone who had run enough review boards to know that the truth of an operation emerged slowly through accumulation, and that the first account given was almost never the complete one. He opened the session by reading the scope of review into the record, the decision to abandon the approved extraction route, the command transfer sequence, the alternate route execution, and the security breach at the planning level that had placed surveillance on the northern LZ. He read all of it without emphasis. Then he looked at Claire. Let's begin, he said. Claire had prepared for this review the same way she prepared for operations. Thoroughly, honestly, without building a case for herself, and without conceding things that weren't true. She had written a 12-page operational account, single-spaced, that described every significant decision chronologically, identified the information available at each decision point, named the alternative options she had considered, and assessed the outcome of each choice, including the seawall passage, which she had given its own paragraph, with the specific notation that the error had been hers. The correction had been Ortiz's contribution, and the net cost had been 12 minutes. She handed that document to the board at the start of the session. Rear Admiral Cole read the seawall paragraph immediately. Before reading anything else, he made a small sound, not approval, not disapproval, just the sound of a person registering something that had caught his attention, and read the rest. The questioning ran for 3 hours. Cole asked about the LZ verification decision, The way Voss had asked about it precisely, with the particular pressure of a question that wanted to find the junction between caution and hesitation and determine which one had been operating. Claire answered the same way she had answered Voss. The inconsistencies she had observed were specific and observable. The verification was recommended by her and authorized by Harrow, and the verification produced actionable intelligence that changed the operation. She did not claim the decision was obviously correct before it was made. She described the information she had and the judgment she applied to it. Some commanders, at the 90-minute mark, would have called the verification a delay, would have argued that the harbor activity was unconfirmed and that the cost of losing time to the weather outweighed the benefit of confirming a threat that might not have existed. Yes, sir, Claire said. Chief Petty Officer Keene argued exactly that. He did. And you still made the recommendation? Yes, sir. Because the specific inconsistencies I observed, the moved beacon, the delayed weather reports, the disturbed road surface were not consistent with a secure LZ. Any one of them might have had an innocent explanation. Together, they constituted a pattern I wasn't willing to dismiss without verification. Cole made a note. And Commander Harrow accepted your recommendation. He did, if he hadn't. If he had ordered the team to proceed toward the LZ without verification, Claire held his eyes. I would have complied, and I would have documented my recommendation and the decision in the operational record, not pushed back harder? No, sir. I made the recommendation. The commander made the call. That's the structure. She paused. If I believed the commander's decision would result in immediate, preventable casualties, I would push back through the chain. A verification delay isn't that threshold. Cole nodded. He moved on. The security breach section came at the 2-hour mark, and it was here that the review board's questioning shifted in a way Claire had been expecting and had been careful not to anticipate in her 12-page account. The planning documentation for Operation Safe Tide, including the approved extraction route, had been accessed by 6 individuals beyond the core operational team. Intelligence analysis had narrowed that group. 2 had been cleared definitively. 2 were under active investigation. 2 had been identified as the probable source of the leak. A junior planning officer and a civilian contractor with access to the Maritime intelligence database, who had connections to the smuggling organization that had seized Grayhaven Island's harbor. Cole told Claire this at the 2-hour mark, watching her face as he did. She had not known the specifics. She had known from Harrow's comment in the recovery room, and from Voss's careful phrasing in the initial debrief, and from her own 7th note on the contingency corrections list, that an investigation was underway and that it was serious. But the 2 probable sources were names she had not heard before, and the civilian contractor connection was a detail that changed the shape of the entire mission in retrospect. The surveillance on the LZ was placed not as a reaction to your team's movements, Cole said, but in anticipation of the planned route. They knew where you were going before you left Fort Sable. Claire held that for a moment. Which means, she said, that the original extraction route had been compromised at the planning level, and any team that ran the approved route without the verification and the contingency would have arrived at a prepared position. Correct, Cole said. 17 people, Claire said. Not a question. Just naming what that meant. Yes, Cole said. 17 people. He looked at her steadily. The board's preliminary view is that your decision to recommend verification and your preparation of the contingency route were the operational factors that prevented a mass casualty event. That view is supported by the intelligence record. He paused. I want to be precise about this, Lieutenant. The board is not simply acknowledging that the contingency worked. We are finding that the contingency was built on sound planning methodology, that the recommendation to verify the LZ was sound judgment under the available information, and that the execution of the alternate route under hostile conditions and command succession represents a standard of performance that warrants formal recognition. Claire said nothing for a moment. I want that finding to reflect the team's performance, she said. Not mine individually. Walsh's beacon work, or T's route knowledge, Dunn's medical management of 2 injured personnel, Keene's defensive organization in the final 14 minutes, none of those are my performance. They're the people I had the good fortune to be working with. Cole studied her. We'll note individual contributions in the supporting record. The primary finding will accurately reflect your command responsibility and your decisions. He closed the folder in front of him. Is there anything you want to add to the record before we conclude? Claire thought about it for a genuine 3 seconds, which was longer than the question usually got. The 7th item, she said. Cole looked up. In my operational account, there's a note at the end, item 7 on the corrections. Security protocol for approved route documentation. The investigation will address the breach, but the protocol that allowed a civilian contractor to access operational route planning in the first place, that's a structural problem, not just an individual one. She paused. I'd ask the board to consider a review of the access controls around extraction route documentation for all joint operations involving civilian intelligence support. Cole wrote that down. Long enough for her to see that he wrote the full substance of it, not just a reference. Thank you, Lieutenant, he said. This board is concluded. She walked out of the conference room into the corridor and stood there for a moment, alone, doing what she always did after something significant concluded. She let it settle. Not celebration, not relief, not any of the performed reactions that moments like this sometimes generated. Just the quiet internal recognition that the correct thing had been done and the record would reflect it. And that was as much as she could ask for. Keene's session with Admiral Voss happened 4 days after the review board, in a separate proceeding that Claire was not present for and that she did not ask about. She knew it was happening. She knew it was the consequence session Voss had referenced in the initial debrief. She knew its outcome would be a formal notation in Keene's service record and a temporary removal from his current training assignment. Those were the facts as she understood them, and they were the correct facts, the kind of accountability that the situation required. What she didn't know, until Dunn told her that evening, was what Keene had said during his session. He gave the complete account, Dunn said. They were in the base cafeteria, which was the kind of place that was always open and always had food that was better than it had any right to be at the institutional level. Everything he said in the staging bay, the way it landed with the junior operators, his assessment of why he said it. Dunn looked at his food. Voss asked him directly whether his concerns about your fitness had been operational or personal. He said personal, straight out. That took something, Claire said. Yeah. Dunn looked at her. He also told Voss that your command on Grayhaven represented the highest standard of mission execution he had personally observed in 17 years of service. He paused. Those were his exact words. I got them from Torres. Who got them from the admin officer who processed the session record. Claire looked at her coffee. The base cafeteria coffee was marginally better than the conference room coffee. She drank it and thought about Travis Keene sitting across a table from Admiral Voss, saying those words not because it would reduce his consequence, not because anyone would see it and give him credit for it, but because it was the accurate account. It didn't reduce the formal consequence, Dunn said. It shouldn't have, Claire said. No, Dunn stirred something in his bowl. He's been reassigned to logistics coordination for the next 3 months. Removed from the combat training track. That was a significant consequence for a man of Keene's experience and investment. Not career-ending, not even close, but real, and felt, and public within the community in the way that assignment changes always were. Claire knew that Keene knew the people who would see the reassignment and draw the obvious conclusion. He'll work through it, Dunn said. He will, Claire agreed. Because she had seen what Keene did when a situation told him he was wrong, and he had enough integrity to hear it. He corrected. Slowly, painfully, but with the full commitment of a man who understood that the correction was the point. She was not without empathy for the process. The rehabilitation protocol started the day after the review board concluded, with a physical therapy session at the base medical facility that was sufficiently demanding to make clear that the next 4 months were going to require the same quality of honest effort as anything she had done on Grayhaven. Dr. Reyes had been specific. The tissue repair required progressive load, no short, and a willingness to report pain accurately rather than managing it internally, the way operators were trained to manage it, because the alternative, loading a healing joint incorrectly because the accurate pain report seemed like weakness, was how people re-injured themselves and extended 4 months into 8. Claire reported accurately. It was the same discipline she had applied to the seawall assessment, to the debrief account, to the review board testimony. The same quality operating in a physical context. She named what hurt, and she named how much, and she let the therapist make the calls about load and timing. Because the therapist had the expertise she didn't have in this specific domain, and asking the right people for what she didn't have was something she had learned the value of in a maintenance corridor on an island that was probably still sitting under the aftermath of a cyclone. The contingency extraction program redesign started in the second week, in parallel with rehabilitation, and it absorbed every hour that wasn't occupied by physical therapy or the ongoing investigation process. Claire worked from a desk in a small office that Commander Harrow, now in his own rehabilitation, post-surgery, running the recovery ward with the same focused energy he brought to everything, had arranged for her with the specific efficiency of a commander who understood that keeping good people usefully occupied was as important as the operational missions themselves. She started with the 7 items on the corrections list. Item 1 through 6 generated protocol revisions, training amendments, equipment specification updates, and what she was calling internally in the document drafts adversarial frameworks, which was the formal way of describing what she had done on Grayhaven when she noticed the moved beacon, the delayed weather reports, the disturbed road surface, and chose to treat them as a pattern rather than as individual data points with innocent explanations. She was building that into the standard, not as a checklist. Checklists were for conditions that stayed the same, and hostile environments did not stay the same, but as a trained habit of mind. The ability to look at an accumulation of small inconsistencies and ask, what if this is what it looks like? What if the plan is already compromised, and I don't know it yet? Item 7, the security protocol she submitted as a separate memorandum to the review board supporting officer. The memo was 3 pages, specific, and included a proposed amendment to the Joint Operational Planning Access Protocols that would restrict civilian contractor access to specific route documentation categories. She wrote it carefully and submitted it without attaching her name to it,
as a recommendation,
because the point was for the idea to be evaluated on its merit rather than for the name attached to it to determine its reception. She knew that this was also a form of the same discipline, separating the work from the ego, letting the product be the thing that mattered. Harrow read the memo when she gave him a copy. You didn't put your name on it, he said. It's a technical protocol proposal, Claire said. The review board can assess its merit independently. Harrow looked at her over the desk. You know it's going to be attributed to you anyway. Probably, she said. That's fine. I just didn't want the attribution to be the reason it was accepted or rejected. Harrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to tell you something I told Keene about you. Before the operation. She looked at him. I told him that you were the best contingency planner I had worked with in 20 years, Harrow said. He didn't believe me. I expected that. He set the memo down. What I didn't tell him, what I didn't tell anyone, because it wasn't operationally relevant, is that the reason you're the best contingency planner I've worked with is that you have the specific combination of intellectual honesty and emotional restraint that contingency planning requires. You can be wrong in your head without it destroying your confidence. You can accept a correction without making the correction about you. He paused. That's rarer than any technical skill, and it's what kept 17 people alive on that island. Claire held his eyes. She did not deflect. She did not reach for the team credit reflex that she had used in the review board. She held it, and she accepted it, because Harrow had told her in the recovery room to own the correct things the same way she owned the seawall, and this was her living by that instruction. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Now go fix item 6, he said. "The communications waterproofing specification is a good idea, and I want it submitted by Friday." She went back to her desk. The 4 months had a rhythm to them that she had not expected, but came to understand as productive in its own way. The mornings were physical therapy, load progression, the slow and occasionally frustrating work of rebuilding a joint that wanted more time than she wanted to give it. The afternoons were intellectual, the program redesign, the protocol memos, the training framework that was accumulating into something that she was beginning to call, in her internal drafts, a methodology rather than a manual. The difference mattered to her. A manual told people what to do. A methodology taught people how to think. And the thing she had learned on Grayhaven, the thing she was trying to build into a framework that the next team could use in the next compromised operation, was fundamentally a thinking framework, not a procedure checklist. She brought Dunn into it in the 3rd week. She asked for his perspective on the medical management section, specifically the decision framework around injured personnel and movement under threat. He spent 2 afternoons with her going through it, and the framework that came out of those sessions was better than what she would have produced alone. She noted his contribution explicitly in the document's methodology section, with his name attached. She brought Walsh in remotely. He was still in recovery in a hospital in Seattle, his ankle being rebuilt with the hardware that he had suspected would be necessary, and 2 phone calls with him on the guidance beacon protocols. He had thoughts, clear, specific, engineering-grade thoughts about the assumptions that maritime contingency planning made about beacon infrastructure, and what happened when those assumptions met 40-year-old equipment on an abandoned island. She wrote those thoughts into the framework with the same specific attribution. The product was becoming something. She could feel it taking shape the way she had felt the bypass solution, taking shape under Walsh's instruction, not elegant, not finished, but functional and real and built from the actual experience of people who had been in the situation, rather than people who had theorized about it from a safe distance. On a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week, she received a formal message from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. She read it twice. Then she went to Harrow's office and handed it to him without comment. He read it. "Commendation," he said. "With a request for a formal presentation at the next unit brief," Claire said. "Which means doing it in front of the team. You have a problem with that?" She thought about it honestly. "I have a concern that it will look like the story is finished. That bringing everyone into a room and giving me a commendation will feel like the resolution, and people will stop paying attention to the work that still needs doing." She paused. "I'd like to tie the presentation to a briefing on the new framework, so that what the team takes away is the methodology, not the ceremony." Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. "I'll call Admiral Voss's office," he said. "I believe she'll agree with that approach." Voss agreed. The presentation was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which gave Claire time to finish the core sections of the framework and prepare a version that could be walked through with the team in a practical context, not a slide deck, not an abstract overview, but an actual working session where the methodology was applied to a hypothetical scenario, and the team tested it against their own experience. She was not finished. Not with the shoulder, not with the framework, not with the longer process of changing what a team believed about leadership and planning, and the specific, quiet courage of admitting that you don't have the route and asking the person beside you if she does. But she was working, honestly, clearly, with the full weight of what Grayhaven had taught her and the full commitment of a person who had decided, somewhere between the boarding rail and the cafeteria coffee, that the next 4 months were not a delay in her career. They were the work itself. The message from Ortiz arrived in the 4th week. A formal email, through official channels, with a courtesy copy to Harrow and Admiral Voss. It confirmed that the medical records she had carried off Grayhaven Island had been successfully submitted to the Environmental Health Authority, that the contamination risk to the island's drinking water had been identified and a remediation plan was underway, and that all 9 members of her relief team had returned to their home countries safely. The last paragraph was not official. It was 2 sentences. I don't send notes like this often, but what you did on that island deserved to be acknowledged by someone who was there when you did it. Claire read it 3 times. She printed it and put it in the folder with the 7 items on the corrections list and the 12-page operational account and the memo about security protocols, in the same way that a person who had decided to own her decisions fully put everything in the same place, the errors and the acknowledgments together, neither diminishing the other. She went back to the framework. Item 6. The communications waterproofing specification was submitted to Harrow on Thursday. 1 day early. The commendation ceremony happened on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the review board concluded, in the main briefing room at Fort Sable that still smelled faintly of the coffee that had been consumed in it during thousands of planning sessions and debriefs, and the particular institutional life of a working special operations base. Claire had been in this room dozens of times. She had stood at the storm map in this room and let Travis Keene's verdict hang in the air above her. She had sat at the table in this room and listened to Commander Harrow accelerate the timetable and known that the operation was already becoming something different from the one they had planned. She stood at the front of the room now, with Admiral Voss on her left and Commander Harrow walking with a cane, 3 weeks out of his post-surgery rehabilitation, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who intended to stop using the cane before anyone expected him to on her right. The team was in the chairs in front of her, along with a contingent of senior personnel from the Naval Station and 2 representatives from the Joint Operations Command who had flown in from Washington the night before. Keene was in the second row. He was in his dress uniform, which meant he had come from the logistics coordination assignment that had been his consequence for the last 3 months. He looked like a man who was doing the work he had been assigned to do and was not performing resentment about it. Claire noticed that too. Voss read the commendation. It was formal, precise, and longer than commendations usually were, because it named specific decisions and their specific outcomes rather than summarizing the operation in the abstract language that commendations often defaulted to. It named the LZ verification. It named the command transfer. It named the beacon restoration and the defensive consolidation and the final count of 17. It named, carefully and without editorializing, the fact that Claire had self-identified and corrected an error in execution during the operation and had reported that error accurately in both the debrief and the formal review. That last part was Voss's addition. Claire had not asked for it. She suspected Harrow had suggested it, and she suspected Voss had agreed, because she understood what it said about character more precisely than any amount of correct decisions could say on its own. When Voss finished reading, she presented the commendation and shook Claire's hand with the grip of a person who meant the gesture. The room applauded. Claire stood through it without performing humility and without performing triumph, which was the correct response, and also, she was aware, the hardest one to sustain naturally when 30 people were looking at you, and you had been through the particular kind of experience that made public acknowledgement feel simultaneously deserved and insufficient. Then Voss stepped back. Lieutenant Rourke has asked to use the remainder of this session as a working brief, Voss said, rather than a ceremony. I've agreed, because I think what she's built deserves to be walked through with the people who will use it. The commendation is noted in the record. Now let's do the work. The room shifted. People moved forward. Harrow took a chair at the side. Voss stayed standing, which was characteristic of her. She did not sit during working sessions, because sitting implied that the information was flowing in one direction and she was a recipient of it. and she was never purely a recipient. Claire set the commendation on the table behind her, picked up the framework document she'd spent 4 months building, and turned to face the team. "This is called the contingency adaptation methodology," she said. "It is not a checklist, it is not a decision tree. It is a framework for thinking about what happens when the plan breaks. Because the plan will break. And the question is never whether you have a backup, it is whether you have the mental habits to build one in real time from what's actually available." She looked around the room. Grayhaven broke the plan in 6 places simultaneously. The LZ was compromised. The helicopter was pushed back by weather. The seawall flooded early. The radio went down. The commander was injured. The harbor group closed our rear approach. She paused. Any one of those individually is a contingency you train for. All 6 simultaneously is a different problem, and the solution to that problem is not a better checklist. It is a different way of seeing the situation. The room was quiet in the specific way of people who were paying attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak. She walked them through it methodically. The adversarial assumption framework, the discipline of asking what the situation would look like if the plan were already compromised, applied before the evidence of compromise was conclusive. The resource substitution principle, the practice of mapping human expertise in the room and treating it as an operational asset equal to equipment, which was what she had done when she turned to Ortiz for the maintenance corridor and to Walsh for the beacon bypass. The correction protocol, the specific discipline of naming an error immediately upon recognition rather than managing it silently. Because the 12 minutes the seawall detour cost were recovered from the time that silence would have cost. She paused at the correction protocol. "I want to be specific about this one," she said, "because I think it's the section that most directly contradicts how a lot of us were trained." She looked at the team. "We are trained to project certainty. We are trained that hesitation is contagious, and that a commander who shows doubt undermines the team's confidence. That is true in some contexts. In a compromised operation with a fluid threat environment, it is actively dangerous." She looked at the specific section of the document. "When I told the team the seawall was wrong, and we needed to reroute, I had 2 options. I could manage the correction internally, tell the team we were taking an alternate path without identifying that it was a correction, or I could name it clearly. I named it clearly, because the team needed to understand that I was responding to new information, not operating from a plan that was still intact. That transparency changed how they responded to the next decision." She paused. "Trust is not built by appearing infallible. It is built by demonstrating that you will tell the truth about the situation, even when the truth is that you got something wrong." She let that sit for a moment. Keene in the second row was looking at the document in his hands. His expression was specific, the look of a man processing an argument that was reorganizing something he had previously understood as fixed. One of the junior operators, a young petty officer named Reyes who had been at Fort Sable for 8 months and had not been on the Grayhaven operation, raised his hand. "Lieutenant, the adversarial assumption framework, when you flag inconsistencies at the LZ, you're essentially treating the situation as compromised before you have proof of compromise. How do you avoid that becoming paranoia? How do you know when to trust the plan?" It was a good question. Claire had anticipated it and had specifically not pre-written the answer because she wanted to answer it in the room rather than from a document. "You don't apply the framework to the plan," she said. "You apply it to the environment. The plan doesn't need to be assumed compromised, the environment does. The plan is what you made with the best available information. The environment is what's actually there when you arrive." She looked at Reyes directly. "On Grayhaven, the plan was correct for the information we had. The environment had changed. The adversarial assumption framework is the discipline of asking, what does this environment tell me that the plan doesn't know yet? It's not distrust of the plan, it is respect for the gap between what we planned for and what's in front of us." Reyes nodded. Wrote something. A second operator, Torres, who had been on Grayhaven, spoke from 3 seats down. The resource substitution principle, Torres said. Using Ortiz and Walsh. When you turned to them, did the team's confidence in you go up or down? The room was very quiet. Ask the team, Claire said. She looked at the operators who had been on Grayhaven. Torres, Mac, Chen, Dunn. She looked at Keene. I'm not the right person to answer that. I know what I experienced. I don't know what you experienced. Dunn spoke first. Up, he said simply, because you were asking the right people for the right things. You weren't asking Ortiz because you didn't know what to do. You were asking her because she knew something specific that you didn't. And you recognized that. He looked at the room. That is different from not knowing what to do. It's a completely different thing, and I think a lot of us couldn't tell those two things apart before Grayhaven. Mac. From the back, second that. Torres, yeah. Chen said nothing. But he nodded once, which from Chen was a significant quantity of endorsement. Claire let those answers stand in the room. Then she looked at Keene. He had not spoken yet. He had been listening with the full attention of a man who had decided that listening was the correct activity and who was doing it without performing it. He met her eyes when she looked at him. Chief Petty Officer Keene Voss said. From the side of the room. Her voice was level and without particular inflection, which meant it carried more weight than it would have with any inflection applied. You've had 3 months with the logistics coordination assignment and a specific corrective requirement to rebuild trust within this unit. I'd like to hear your assessment of the methodology you've just been walked through. The room went still in the way. Rooms went still when something real was about to happen. Keene set the document down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the team, not at Voss, not at Harrow, not at Claire, at the operators in the chairs around him, the junior ones who had laughed in the staging bay, the ones who had been at Fort Sable when he said what he said, the ones who were still forming their understanding of what leadership looked like. I owe this team a complete account, Keene said. His voice was even. Not rehearsed, she could hear the difference, had been around Travis Keene long enough to know when he was performing and when he wasn't. This wasn't performance. Before Operation Safe Tide, I stood in the staging bay and told everyone in earshot that Lieutenant Rourke was the weakest link, that she would be the reason someone didn't come home. He paused. I believed I was making an operational observation. I was not. I was protecting a version of this team that I had built in my head over 4 years, and Lieutenant Rourke's presence challenged that version. And I responded to the challenge by attacking the person instead of examining the assumption. He looked around the room. I was wrong. Not marginally wrong, substantially. Consequentially wrong. And the junior personnel in this room who heard me say what I said and who may have made professional judgments based on what I modeled for them. I want you to understand that what I modeled was not how this works. It is not how leadership works. It is not how this team operates. He paused again. What you watched Lieutenant Rourke do on Grayhaven Island, that is how this works. The room held the silence for exactly as long as it needed to. Then Voss said, "Thank you, Chief," and the room breathed. Claire looked at Keene. He met her eyes briefly, and what passed between them in that moment was not forgiveness. Forgiveness implied a ledger being closed. And the ledger wasn't the point. What passed between them was something more like mutual recognition. Two people who had been on the same island in the same storm and had both come out of it changed. In different ways and different directions, but changed in ways that were real. She turned back to the room. The last section of the framework, she said, is what I'm calling the culture protocol, which is not a procedure. It is a question that I want every person in this unit to ask themselves before they make a public assessment of another person's capability. She looked at the document. The question is, am I responding to evidence, or am I responding to an assumption that I haven't examined? She looked up. Evidence is observable, specific, and correctable. An assumption is what you bring to the room before the evidence arrives. Both have a place in planning. Only one of them has a place in a public briefing room the night before a mission. She paused. If you can answer that question honestly every time, This team will be harder to break than any hostile environment you will ever operate in. She set the document down. That's the methodology, she said. Any further questions go through Commander Harrow's office. The full framework is available in the unit's operational library as of this morning. She looked at the room one final time. Thank you for your time. The session broke with the specific energy of people who had received something substantive and were already beginning to process it. Conversations started immediately, 2 and 3 people clustering in the way that happened when a briefing had given them something to argue about, rather than simply something to absorb. Reyes cornered Torres with the document open, pointing at the adversarial assumption section. 2 senior operators from the Washington contingent were talking to each other, with the compressed intensity of people making decisions. Harrow was on his feet, cane in hand, crossing toward Voss, with the particular purpose of a man who had 2 things he wanted to say to the Admiral before she left the building. Claire stood at the front of the room and let the motion happen around her. Keene reached her before she left the table. He had the framework document in his hand. He held it up briefly, not as a gesture of approval, but as a reference. The culture protocol, he said. Yes, you wrote that one specifically. I wrote all of it, Claire said. You wrote the others for the team, Keene said. You wrote that one because of me. She looked at him. She could have deflected. She chose not to. I wrote it because of what happened in the staging bay, she said. And because I think it's the most important section in the document. Both of those things are true, simultaneously. Keene looked at the document. It's good, he said. It's the right question. Are you asking it a pause? A long one for Keene, who did not typically allow pauses to exist. Working on it, he said. That's the honest answer. That's the right answer, Claire said. He nodded once and moved toward the door. At the door, he stopped. He turned back, and in front of the remaining people in the room, the senior operators, the Washington contingent, the junior petty officer Reyes, who was still holding the document, Keene said. Lieutenant, she looked at him. Welcome back, he said. It was not a grand statement. It was not performed for the room. It was the specific, unadorned thing that it was, a man telling a colleague that she belonged where she was standing. In the language that meant the most from a person who had spent 3 weeks arguing the opposite. Thank you, Chief, she said. He left. The room finished its conversations and cleared. And Claire stood alone at the table, where, 4 months ago, she had stood with a storm map and a marker while a verdict was delivered. And she felt the full weight of the distance between that moment and this one. Not with triumph, not with the particular satisfaction of having proven someone wrong, in a way that required acknowledgement. Just with the clear, honest recognition of work done and a road still running ahead. Harrow found her there 5 minutes later. Voss wants to talk to you about the security protocol memo, he said. She's taking it to the Joint Operations Command. Your amendment on civilian contractor access is going into the next revision of the Planning Authorization Protocol. Claire absorbed that. The 7th item. The question mark at the bottom of the corrections list. Submitted without her name attached, becoming an actual structural change in the way Joint Operations protected their planning documents. Good, she said. She'll want your input on the implementation language, Harrow said. That means a trip to Washington in the next 6 weeks. When my shoulder clears the next assessment, Claire said. Which is when? 3 weeks. Maybe 2 if the tissue responds the way Reyes expects. Harrow looked at her shoulder with the specific attention of a man who understood injury timelines because he was running one himself. 2 weeks, he said, with the flat confidence of a person making a prediction rather than a wish. 2 weeks, Claire agreed. He walked toward the door, cane clicking with the precise rhythm of a man who had made peace with his recovery timeline and was extracting maximum utility from it. At the door, he stopped. Rourke, he said. Sir. The framework. He had the document in his hand. He had picked up a copy at some point during the session without her noticing. He held it briefly. Page 11. The section on command succession. Under hostile conditions, he paused. It's the best thing in it. She had written that section last. in the final week after everything else was in place. It was the section about what happened when the person at the front of the formation went down and the team had to keep moving. It was the section that she had written from the maintenance corridor, not literally, but from the memory of it, from the specific, clarifying reality of standing in a tunnel with 17 people and hearing Elliot Harrow say, "Lieutenant Rourke, you have the team." She had written it for the next person who would hear those words, or words like them, in the next tunnel or the next island or the next operation that broke in 6 places simultaneously. She had written it so that person would want to have something to stand on when the ground was insufficient. "Thank you, sir," she said. Harrow left. Claire picked up her copy of the framework and her copy of the commendation and put them both in the same folder. Then she sat down at the briefing table, the same table. The same room, the same 4 walls that had heard Travis Keene deliver his verdict and had now heard him deliver its reversal, and she wrote 2 more items on the corrections list. Item 8. Review the succession training curriculum for junior officers. Ensure the framework's command succession section is incorporated into the pre-deployment preparation standard. Her name on it. Item 9. Follow up with Walsh on the guidance beacon specification memo. His engineering assessment deserved a formal co-authorship credit in the framework's technical appendix. She wrote them both clearly, with her name where it belonged and Walsh's name where it belonged, because ownership was not only about accountability for errors. It was about accountability for contributions, and Walsh had solved the problem that kept the light on. And the world needed to know who had done that. She closed the folder. She sat in the quiet of the empty briefing room and thought about the next team that would board an aircraft from this base, carrying into some other compromised operation the lessons that Grayhaven had produced. She thought about Reyes, 23 years old, holding the document and arguing with Torres about the adversarial's assumption frameworks, with the energy of a person who had encountered an idea that reorganized something fundamental. She thought about the junior planning officers at the Joint Operations Command who would read the revised access protocol amendment and implement it without ever knowing that it had started as a question mark at the bottom of a corrections list, written by a lieutenant on restricted rest during the first week of her rehabilitation. That was how things changed. Not in ceremonies, not in single dramatic moments of vindication. In the quiet accumulated work of people who kept asking the right questions and writing down the right answers and putting the right names where they belonged and going back the next day to write item 9. The weakest link, Chief Travis Keene had said. In this room. At that table. 3 weeks before an operation that broke in 6 places simultaneously and brought 17 people home. The weakest link. She picked up her folder and stood up. The lesson that Grayhaven had put into the world, the one she had built into a methodology and walked through with a team and submitted to an admiral and written into item 8 and item 9 and the culture protocol and the correction protocol. And page 11 was not that she had proved him wrong. It was simpler than that, and harder, and more important than any individual proof of anything. Strength was not the person at the front who never needed help. Strength was the maintenance corridor found by the person who had been on the island for 4 days. Strength was the beacon restored by the engineer with a broken ankle who was asked the right question. Strength was the admission that the seawall was wrong and the detour was necessary, and the 12 minutes were the correct cost. Strength was the senior man in the second row setting the document down and telling the junior operators that what he had modeled was not how this worked. Strength was every person in that tunnel, choosing to keep moving when stopping felt like the more survivable option, because the person at the front had told the truth about the situation, and they had trusted her because she had earned it, not by being infallible, but by being honest. She walked out of the briefing room, through the corridor, out into the working air of Fort Sable Joint Maritime Base, where the next operation was already being planned by people who were about to learn something new about what a plan was for. And Lieutenant Claire Rourke, the weakest link, the alternate commander, The woman who had asked the right questions in the right tunnels and built the right framework from what was available went back to work.